You too.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today in this holy season. I want you to, let's talk about Syria, everybody. I do not know what's going on. This is a space that I really do not understand. And so I brought in two of the most brilliant people in the world. And this is one of the times when I don't even go looking for guests. My father will say, hey, go to this person. And you know, I always go to her, Phyllis Bennis. I mean, she is so brilliant, so brilliant. She's really helped us to. She's really helped to deepen and broaden and sharpen my understanding of global conflicts, and at this point, specifically the Middle East. But you have been involved in looking at global conflicts really all of my life, most of it, and certainly you and Reverend go back decades, really fighting for justice all over the world. And so I just want to welcome you back to the show as we talk about, goodness gracious, what's happening in Syria, of course, the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. But I just wanted to, I'm looking for this story, I wanted to bring it up for you. This is in The Sun, the British newspaper. And this is the headline: Colossal Blast. Moment Israeli earthquake bomb hit Syria in heaviest blitz on region for 12 years that registered on the Richter scale. Oh, yes, you call his name because this is a lot. There's this picture that looks like Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And of course, the caption is, this is the dramatic moment a colossal explosion erupted in Syria. And they're calling the video astounding. But what is really, really astonishing is that this blast, this bomb was so powerful that it measured a 3.0 on the Richter scale. That is an earthquake. What is going on over there? People are saying that this really puts us in the Greater Israel Project. Of course, in 2023, in the fall, when the UN meets, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu famously presented a map of the Middle East, the new Middle East, and Palestine was not on it. But what was conspicuous about this map was how much Israel had expanded. And let's be clear, I want you to explain to us what Israel means, not biblically, but in terms of business. Because, this is like really a colonial project. And I think that we need to, that's why the UK's in it. The United States are in it. I mean, all these people, all these groups have business interest in that region. So I think it's a lot more complex, Phyllis Bennis, than we know. So take it away. I'm taking notes, literally.
It is a very complicated situation, and I'm really glad to be with you, Santita, not least because whenever I'm with you, we get to actually talk about root causes and not just look at these astonishing and horrifying headlines. When I look at what's happened in Syria just in this last week, it's been 10 days, that's all, of this new initiative, the new Syria, the collapse of the regime. It's shocking that it all happened so fast. And many aspects of it are shocking. Others are shocking, but not surprising. So the first act of the United States with the overthrow of the Assad regime, which the US had, let's say, not liked very much, had sanctioned, had refused normal diplomatic relations, etc. The first act of the United States was 75 airstrikes across the country, claiming that they were going after ISIS centers. Maybe that's true, maybe it's partly true, maybe it's not true at all. But their first act was 75 attacks on Syrian targets, inside Syrian airspace, inside Syrian territory. Israel's first act was between 350 and 400 airstrikes across Syria, bragging that they had destroyed all of Syria's defenses. They had gone after military bases, they had gone after anti-aircraft equipment that is purely defensive. They destroyed it all. And then they managed to reoccupy a large part of the so-called buffer zone between the officially occupied part of Syria, known as the Golan Heights, which Israel occupied back in 1967, and in 1981 announced to the world that it was now officially part of Israel, something that no one in the world acknowledged until, wait for it, until then President Trump went to Israel in 2018 and announced that he now accepts on behalf of the United States that the Golan Heights is part of Israel, that Israeli sovereignty is now recognized by Israel. And unfortunately, President Biden, who said he didn't agree with that, never reversed it. So this is also Biden's policy to recognize that illegally occupied territory as belonging to Israel.
If I may interrupt you here,
Sure.
why do you think because I've listened to everything that you say. Do you think it's important that we acknowledge that President Trump and President Biden, a Republican and a Democrat, signed on to this?
Yeah, I do think it's important because it's important to recognize how much of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and particularly, not only, but particularly U.S. policy towards Israel. It's not even a policy towards the Palestinians. They're the victims of it. But the policy is aimed at shoring up Israel as the most important, strongest, wealthiest, closest ally of the United States in the region. And that has its impact in Syria right now, certainly across Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, across the region. So that's what we're looking at here, is a unified bipartisan policy that's been in effect, at least at this level, since 1967. What's different now, Santita, and it is important, is that the gap in policy is not so much between how the votes come down in Congress, where you see far too many Democrats, far too many members of the Progressive Caucus, who turn out to be not so progressive when it comes to foreign policy, and especially when it comes to policy towards Israel and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, etc. But far too many of them have the same position as Republicans do. The gap, which is now broader than ever, is not that gap between the two parties at the congressional level. It's between the base of the Democratic Party, which has overwhelmingly broken with that long-standing party position, and the leadership, the electeds of the party. That's where there's this huge gap. So if you look at the polls, the Democrats are vastly different now than the Republicans on this kind of a policy. 77% of Democrats want an end right now to transferring weapons to Israel because of the genocide that's underway in Gaza. Now, would all of them say that it's a genocide? Maybe not. But they all agree, 77%, there's never percentages like that. 77% of Democrats say that there should be an end to transferring arms to Israel. But if you look at how the votes come down in Congress, it isn't close to 77% of the Democratic members of Congress. It's a brave few, brave few. So that's where the gap is between the electeds and the base of the party. That's, I think, crucially important. Coming back to Syria, I think that this is one of those moments where we have to be able to keep two, maybe a lot more than two, but at least two competing ideas in our minds simultaneously. So on the one hand, the first image that many of us have seen of this overthrow of the government in Syria and the rise of maybe some kind of a new government, none of that is very clear. What was clear is people rushing to the prisons to let out the prisoners, the political prisoners who in their thousands had been detained, arrested, many tortured, many disappeared, and many killed by this regime. There is the claim that this was somehow part of the axis of resistance. It was anti-imperialist. It was many things, but it was rarely all of that. If we look back in history, we can see how this regime cooperated with the United States. The US outsourced torture of detainees to Syria in the so-called global war on terror. starting in 2004 and going on for several more years. And that was only one thing. The Syrian regime went after Palestinians. The massacre of Tel Zatar, a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, that Syria attacked in 1976 in a brutal massacre. This was under the father of the last Assad government in Syria. So this is a very complicated situation. When the US went to war against Iraq in 2003, the Syrian Air Force was part of the coalition bombing Baghdad in support of the United States. And then when we saw people pouring out of the prisons and families reunited for the first time, that has to be worth a lot. That has to be worth something. At the same time, we see Israel and the United States and now Turkey taking advantage of this moment. Israel land grabbing on a massive scale, bombing at a massive scale. This new bomb you just talked about, the earthquake bomb, registering 3.0 on the Richter scale. That's unprecedented. That's unprecedented. And it goes to what is the US enabling of that? The US is providing 75% of Israel's weapons, including what they call the bunker buster bombs, 2,000-pound bombs that can decimate and have an entire city block, bringing down all the buildings and killing hundreds with one bomb, with one bomb. That's what 77% of Democrats in this country are demanding to come to an end, to stop. Don't send them anymore. And that is still being said. So we have to keep in mind both of those realities. This regime in Syria was very weak by this time. The military was not willing to support it. And
were they weak or were they weakened?
They had been weakened for many, many years by years of civil war, by US imposed and international sanctions, by a series of economic crises that included the response to drought conditions in the country that, for example, forced many people who worked as farmers for generations to leave their farms because they could no longer make a living. They couldn't grow wheat. There was simply no water. They were driven into the cities where there were no jobs. People were left without access to being able to make a living to support their families. So all of this led to instability. All of this weakened the support for the government. Some of it was caused by policies of the United States, the Europeans, certainly Israel, the theft of territory by Israel and the international community, as it's called, allowing that to go forward, and problems of the regime itself being a very brutal, very repressive regime where people were afraid to speak up. The protest movement that began in 2011 in the context of the Arab Spring, which began with heroic young people, mainly really children, young teenagers, 13, 14, 15 years old, writing signs criticizing the regime. And those children were the first victims of that resistance movement that began so heroically. Many of them were arrested. It morphed very quickly into a very different kind of protest movement. Within about a year, it was no longer a protest movement. It had become a full-scale war, a full-scale civil war that ultimately, I wrote a book on this some years ago, there were 7 separate wars being waged in Syria at that time between a set of forces backed by the United States, backed by Turkey, backed by Israel, backed by other countries outside, as well as the regime being backed by by Iran and backed later by Russia, who came to its defense in 2015 with bombing of these opposition forces. And the opposition forces by then were not these heroic, liberal and radical young people who were fighting for democracy and fighting for free speech. It was now extremist religious forces, Islamist forces, including some that were tied to Al-Qaeda, others that were tied to ISIS. That's the origin of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS that we're hearing a lot about right now, which is so far the main force that led this movement just in the last 2 weeks to overthrow the regime. They were, the leader of that, had been part of ISIS. Then when he broke with ISIS, he was part of what became the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, known as the Nusra Front. He was the head of that. And then he created this new organization called, well, easier to call it HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which they say, the people in it now say that they are no longer Islamists. They are a secular force. They want democracy. They want equality for all the various sects inside Syria. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. We don't know yet. The Syrian people don't know yet who they are, what they represent, what they stand for, what they will allow or not allow. Will they reflect the extremism of their earlier positions? Will women's rights be destroyed? Syria was a very secular country, and in many ways was a very modern country in the sense of women's rights, in the sense of education for everyone, all of those things. So despite the extraordinary levels of repression, there were social and economic rights that were quite well defended under this regime. Will that continue? We don't know. None of this is clear yet. The Kurdish forces that have been fighting for rights, national rights, and cultural rights inside Syria for a long time have been, since that 2011 uprising, have been backed by the United States, which means they're in a very different position right now. The so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, the Kurdish forces, those forces are opposed massively by Turkey. Turkey is supporting the HTS. So there's all these conflicts underway already, which may or may not lead to an escalation of fighting the way we saw in the run-up to the civil war more than a decade ago. Hopefully it will not. That war was devastating to the people of Syria. Whole cities were destroyed. The US destroyed cities. Russian bombing destroyed cities. The regime attacked cities. The guerrilla forces of various sorts attacked cities. And ordinary people suffered and continue to pay an incredibly high price. So all of that is underway simultaneously. And we have to keep all of that in our minds when we think about what solidarity with Syria means. It has to mean welcoming the fact that families are finally able to maybe see their loved ones, at least find out what happened to them perhaps, and bury them. Maybe for some, that will be all. But also recognize what our government is doing, how our government is bombing as its first response. Our government is saying, well, they are still on our terrorism list. We will give them a set of criteria that they have to abide by as a condition before we will take them off the terrorism list. Things like equality for all within the country. And I want to say, really? So all the countries that the US is allied to, Saudi Arabia, you want to talk about Saudi Arabia? You want to talk about Israel? Everybody in the country is going to be treated equally? All of a sudden, Syria is going to be held to this extraordinary level of requirements of what a democracy looks like by US standards. So we have to be very, very careful and very complex in our thinking of how we treat this new development, which is having incredible impacts in the region as a whole, not least that the suddenness of it, the surprise of it, the regional character of it has pushed the question of Palestine and the question of what is underway in the genocide, what is escalating in the Palestine genocide, off the front pages. That's one of the consequences of this action.
And the consequences are dire. I mean, we're talking with Phyllis Bennis Institute for Policy Studies. I have to tell you, to see that a bomb was dropped on this small area in the world, that's not an island, not that dropping these atom bombs in Japan was an inconsequential thing. It was a horrific thing, and they're living with that, with the effects of that to this day. But this is part of a contiguous piece of land, Phyllis Bennis. And you drop a bomb that yields an earthquake. I can only imagine just what has happened in the environment. I'm trying to why do that to the land? I mean,
it's a question of the environment. It's a question of the destruction of cities. A new report from the UN now says that I think more than 50% of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed by Israeli bombing. And this was a territory that was made up of small cinder block houses and a few high-rise apartment buildings. Yeah. It's now destroyed. There is nowhere. There were 36 hospitals in Gaza, Santita. 3 of them now are partially functioning, not very well. None of the others are even partially functioning. They have no water. They have no electricity. Their facilities have been bombed and destroyed. Doctors, healthcare workers, nurses, and patients have been targeted and killed over and over again. It's a shocking, consistent reality that's now been going on almost 15 months. Almost 15 months. And in that context, the notion that it is anything other than central in our understanding and our outrage at what our government is doing with our tax dollars in our name, without our consent. But it is going ahead because so far there has not been enough of a price to pay.
What the price to pay? What price should be paid? And how is this shaping America's image in the world? I mean, we're only 4.5% of the world population, and you spend time out of the country, as do I, and I don't think that Americans are aware of how damaging this is to us, not just in terms of goodwill, but it damages you in terms of, how you're regarded,
Absolutely.
business. People don't trust you. People fear you. They don't like you. They loathe you. We're seen as the war machine in the world, as the warmongers.
We are. And there's a reason for that. It's not a false claim. This is not name calling. This is a reality of where the military construction comes from, who is producing more weapons. If you look at our military budget, Santita, you would have to go to the next 9 countries. And that includes China, Russia, Iran, countries that we like to say are, well, that's why we need, to have a good protection. And that's why we need a huge military budget. Our military budget is nearly $1 trillion. Nearly $1 trillion. It's an unfathomable amount of money. We are now paying, I think it's about 40% of the Israeli military budget. I don't know what percentage of the Ukrainian military budget. And that isn't even counted in this amount of what we are producing. Most of that money goes to military corporations, whose CEOs make more money than almost any other grouping of CEOs in this country. It's a billionaire's paradise.
But
It's
Phyllis, they don't have to be successful. Boeing cannot keep an airplane up in the sky safely.
Yeah, well, that's also good. There's a plane, some of your listeners will have heard of it, called the F-35. This is the plane everybody loves to hate. When people, on the rare occasion that anybody in Washington talks about cutting the military budget, they always start with, well, we have to stop with the, it's a bloated budget and there's waste and fraud. And yeah, that's true, but that's not really the problem. The real problem is our military budget is grounded in the need, as they see it, for a military all around the world to dominate the world. The F-35 is a plane that the Pentagon says they don't want. It's a plane that doesn't work. It has blown up on the tarmac numerous times, and yet it's the most popular plane to send to our allies because it's a very advanced plane, and they can brag about it, that they have access to one of the most advanced planes in the U.S. arsenal. It doesn't even work for what it's supposed to do. And yet they keep buying more. They keep up these contracts for this plane that nobody wants so they can sell them to others, bolstering every step of the way the amount of money going to the makers of the planes, to Boeing, to McDonnell Douglas, to all these companies. And they are making a killing, in every sense of the word, on these wars, regardless of who wins the wars. They continue because the wars continue. This is a militarized society that we're living in. Whenever we hear we don't have enough money for healthcare for all, we don't have enough money for childcare, for elder care, for jobs, for education, we don't have the money for all that. Well, why don't we? Because all of that money, nearly $1 trillion of our tax money, is going directly to the military budget. Is that what's keeping us safer? I don't think so. Is that why we have a lower standard of living and a lower life expectancy than any other wealthy country in the world? Is that what makes us safe, putting all the money into the military instead of into healthcare? We also spend more on healthcare than any of them too, but we don't have good results because it's a profit-driven healthcare system instead of one that's aimed at actually keeping people healthy.
But it seems that war is too. I mean, this is not driven by principle. It seems like it's driven
Right.
by profit. And you know, we've got your friend Dr. John Quigley on. He's going to work out his camera so that we can bring him up.
Oh,
but,
good.
but as we do that, because I don't want you to stop, I need you to help me to understand who are the winners here. I mean, we see that reportedly former President Assad and his family have found asylum in Russia.
Yeah, they are winners. They are winners. Although their reputation will go down as having led a dictatorial regime and a corrupt regime. All of that's true. But in the meantime, they're going to live out their lives very pleasantly in Moscow. They won't be able to travel around the world because there will presumably be various warrants issued against them from the International Criminal Court and elsewhere, which will, unlike those that have already been requested, we don't have the warrants in hand yet, but warrants have been requested by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister Netanyahu and Gallant. But we know that that will not prevent them from visiting the United States, from visiting Britain, from visiting a number of other countries that they would like to go to. Many countries in the world will either be afraid of US consequences, so they will not impose what they are obligated to impose, which is to use those warrants to actually arrest and hold as a prisoner Bibi Netanyahu, or they will simply say, we don't believe that the warrants were accurate in their basis, so we're not going to do it. They'll either choose to, or they will say they are afraid to. With Bashar al-Assad, that will not be the case. If he travels somewhere, he could risk arrest. But that's not the real winners. The real winners are the CEOs and the shareholders of these military corporations in our country. We are the ones who I don't own any shares in them. I hope your listeners don't either. But that's who gains here. The CEOs of those companies, the shareholders of those companies that are producing what makes these wars possible. And when we as a country enable a genocide, it makes our government complicit. Complicity, my friend John will talk more about this, I think. Complicity is a specific crime within the International Covenant Against Genocide. It makes it illegal for any other country to support a genocide, to refuse to halt a genocide if it's in their power, to pay money to a government carrying out a genocide. We're doing all of that. Knowing that it's a genocide, the US position, the Biden administration position is it's a position without merit. It's meritless. They said that before they even read the statement of the South African team that led the case in the International Court of Justice. They took the position that it cannot be genocidal because it's Israel. And Israel is good guys. Israel's on our side. So it can't be. They never came out and said, this accusation is not accurate. This statement is not true. They simply said it can't be. So we don't take it seriously. It is not anything we will respond to. That's how they are responding.
Phyllis Bennis, Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Quigley, we need you to adjust your camera because we are not able to bring you into the studio. When you do that, we will bring you up. In the meantime, Phyllis Bennis, I want to know, as we're looking at, what is the point? I mean, what's the end game here? Because Gaza, October 7th, 2023, was a horrible day.
Yeah.
It was a horrible day. I mean, and everyone agrees on that. But October 8th, October 9th, it got worse. It has gotten worse. It has expanded. It's gone from Gaza. One little portion now is all of Gaza. The West Bank. Now, okay, we're moving into the whole region.
That's right.
And it's like it's being claimed. And I guess I keep going back to like a greater project because Israel was not just created by the Balfour Declaration. Everyone was in that. They could have gone to Uganda. They could have gone to Texas. I mean,
Right.
they had different choices.
They looked at other places. There's this long-standing Zionist slogan that pre-exists the state of Israel that said that this is a, quote, land without a people for a people without a land. Now, Zionism did not become a majority view in the Jewish community until the Holocaust. And at the time of the Holocaust, most people who escaped the Holocaust or who got out before it hit or who survived it wanted to come not to Palestine, to the United States. That's where they had family. They wanted to come to Brooklyn. That's where they had family. That's where they wanted to live. But the combination of anti-communism and anti-Semitism in the United States put very extreme limits on Jews that could come from Europe to the United States at that time. And as a result, many people were given only the option they could escape the Holocaust from Europe into British-run Palestine at that time, before the State of Israel. Once the State of Israel was created, they established a law called the Law of Return that says that any Jew from anywhere in the world, well, maybe not me, but most Jews from anywhere in the world can show up at the airport and claim instant citizenship with all of the rights and privileges of being a Jewish citizen, which in that country is 80% of the population are Jews. And the laws are built for that majority position. The laws are created to privilege Jews. They are the ones who can own land. They are the ones who have access to government support. They are the ones who get instant citizenship. The Palestinians who were expelled at the time of what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, what Israel calls the War of Independence, at that time, the Palestinians were not allowed to come back. They took the keys to their homes thinking they would be back in 2 weeks. And there are now the last generation, they're almost all gone now, they're in their 90s. But the people who survived the Nakba still hold those keys, hoping that maybe they will be able to die in their own land. So far, none have been allowed even to visit, let alone to return. So that's what we're dealing with here. The creation of Israel in the later part, that's when it won support from the Jewish community in the context of the Holocaust. But the creation of Israel goes way back before that. It was part of a colonial enterprise. We see that in the writings of the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl. When he wrote his diaries, he included the letters he had written to the infamous British imperialist for whom Zimbabwe was once called Rhodesia, Cecil Rhodes. And he wrote letters to Cecil Rhodes saying, will you help me get support for this from the British Crown? And we don't know if Cecil Rhodes ever wrote back. That's not indicated there. But in his letters, he asked the question rhetorically and then answered his own question. He said, you might wonder, why am I asking you? You're interested in this little piece of, you're interested in Africa. I'm interested in this little piece of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen. I'm concerned about Jews. So why am I asking you for help? And then he answers his own question and he says, because our projects are both something colonial. Something colonial. When I read that as a young Zionist activist who had become more political as a result of Vietnam, I thought, wait a minute, nobody ever taught me that. What am I missing here? And I went back and read that and found out that that was the origins of this. It was a colonial project. They were quite open about it. It wasn't anything to be ashamed of in those days, those circles. So they talked about it quite openly. And it's in that context that Zionist organizers went around the world to meet with heads of empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, to see who would take them in, who would offer them land in their broad empires. And they thought, well, we could have a state anywhere. It could be in, as you say, Uganda. It could be in Argentina. There were other possibilities. And then they decided if we go to Palestine, we'll get support from religious Jews, which had never been the goal. It was always a secular project.
Why? Why only a secular project and not a religious?
Well, because it was secular Jews who created it. It was in the context of both a colonial movement and a nationalist movement, which involved secular people, as it so often does. There were some religious people involved, of course, but it wasn't primarily a religious movement. It was a secular movement. Then they realized if we make it about Palestine, we'll bring all the religious folks with us because they'll want to go to Palestine claiming that God wrote the real estate contract. And whatever else I might believe about being Jewish, I never believed that God wrote real estate contracts.
Oh gosh.
I seem to believe.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to have to go in a minute, Santita.
Okay. Okay, I was trying to bring up Dr. Quickly, but Dr. Quickly, I need you to come back out and try to come back in because I'm not able to add you onto the stage, but we're going to try and work this out. But I'd like to find out from you, get a word from you, because I mean, you've helped us to understand a lot, because it seems like so much of this, Phyllis Venice, is coming down to business. You know, because colonialism is a business enterprise. I mean, America is a business enterprise.
But not only, both America and Israel are settler colonies. They're not just extractive colonies.
Okay.
Right? That's a part of it now. But the origins of it were as settler colonialism, like the US,
which
like
you come in and
like
sit on it.
Right. We want this land, and that means we want to get rid of the people who were already here. We can do that in different ways. We could do it the South African way, control the population by isolating them in faraway settlements and denying them any rights. We can do it the way the US did, which was genocidal, essentially wipe them out to a very large degree. We can do it in many ways. That was sort of the model also in Australia and New Zealand, somewhat in Canada, somewhat in Israel. Israel, it was about just get rid of them, force them out. It wasn't the kind of large-scale killing that we saw in the United States of the indigenous population. It was drive them off the land. So there's many ways you can do that. But the goal is different than a goal like French, well, let's say the Portuguese in Mozambique. There were some Portuguese people who moved there and ruled the place. But it was never designed to be a large-scale Portuguese population that would be open land for settlement. It was to get access to the resources, to mining, to water, to agriculture, whatever it might be, and the labor of the indigenous population. That's the more traditional kind of colonialism. But then you have settler colonialism, where we want the land. We want this to be our country and not yours. And we're going to get rid of you in any way that we can to make that happen.
I honestly I don't think it's going to work. And I'm telling you, that's why I had to, that headline said it all. I mean, just a bomb or a set of bombs that created an earthquake. And I said, wow, what a metaphor. But here we are. I just don't know where we go from here, Phyllis Venice. I just don't know, because
we start by stopping the genocide. And that means, I think, three things. It means stopping the bombing, just stop. It means allow in massive amounts of humanitarian aid and start the funding again of UNRWA to make that happen. And it means stop sending weapons. All three of those things are required if we are serious about what ceasefire means. That's our job right now. We're going to have to pay a lot of attention to Syria. We're going to have to pay a lot of attention to Lebanon, to the whole region where the US, with our money and in our name, destroying our reputations around the world, is doing a lot of bad stuff. But the first priority to me means stopping the genocide.
We've got to stop the genocide. Well, we almost had Dr. Quickly, but I'm going to give him your best regards. And I thank you, and I cannot wait to connect you to Reverend Jackson in a couple of days.
I look forward to it.
Well, because we have to get an understanding, because every day it seems that this is becoming more and more complex. A lot of people are making money while we at home are struggling. And you can say hello to Dr. John Quickly as you are. Dr. Quickly, don't touch a thing. I think you are there. And I want you to say hello to your dear friend, Phyllis Venice. Dr.
Hey, John.
Quickly?
Very good. Hello, Phyllis.
Great to see you. I'm sorry you had such a hard time getting on because it's right when I have to get off.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's much better to hear from you than from me.
I wouldn't say that. But it's great to see you, Santita. As always, thank you. My love to your dad. I'll talk to him in a few days.
Absolutely. Our love to you. We just thank you for I told you, my father doesn't produce my show, but he will tell me if you're gonna talk about something global, would you please call Phyllis? Because he doesn't want me to fall off the side of the mountain.
We will let you fall off.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Sending
bye.
so much love and happy holidays to you in this whole week.
Same to you. Same to you.
Much love, much love. Professor John Quigley from The Ohio State University. You got to help us to understand. I know I have about a good 10 minutes or so here, but I've got to give you the runway to help us to understand. Syria, it seems okay. October 7th, 2023 was a horrific event, but it was also part of a series of horrific events. And it just seems that I remember 1983 when our troops were bombed in that part of the world. Reagan, who was the farthest right-wing president in our modern history, at least up to that point, he even pulled Israel back. He said, wait, stop, don't do that. But now it seems like more and more countries are being subsumed, they're being consumed. And I see America's reputation being ripped to shreds internationally. Am I reading this correctly? Dr. Quigley?
Well, I think you're right. Our reputation is not being helped by any of this, and quite the opposite. That we're being viewed as the perpetrators of violence and the spreader of war, um, uh, uh, and that's nowhere more clear than in Gaza right now. Where the Biden administration, even though it's about to depart political power, is not willing to do what it could do to improve the situation. And I think we are being perceived around the world correctly, unfortunately, as the perpetrators rather than the problem solvers.
So, what's next? I mean, Assad is gone, but who comes behind him? Who's there now? It seems America is absolutely giddy about the fall of the Assad regime, and I just can't make sense of it because we're in and out with all of these people and we do business with them. We back channel with them all the time. I don't understand what's going on, Professor Quigley.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the United States doesn't know exactly who it is that's coming to power in Syria, but I think we should not be helping Israel, which is bombing Syria right now. This new government in Syria has approached the United Nations to say we are the object of aggression by Israel. Please, you United Nations, do something about it. And nothing is being done about it. Of course, at the United Nations, it's the US that is in charge when it comes to anything military. And we are apparently not trying to stop Israel. In fact, we're giving it the bombs. Israel is using our bombs to bomb Syria right now. And if the object were to have a government in Syria that is going to be friendly to the United States, you would think that the United States would be doing something to try to keep Syria from being bombed. Instead, we're helping it. So I think we are ensuring that the government that comes into power there is not going to be particularly friendly to the United States. Hopefully, it will be supportive of the Palestinians um, because the Palestinians who are being, exterminated virtually in Gaza have very little support, practical support from any of the states in the region. So Syria can be a strong ally of theirs potentially.
Well, is there a goal in mind? I mean, what is the end game here? I mean, is this, I mean, I'm mindful of the fact, and I shared this with Phyllis Bennis, about 30 minutes ago or so, that when when Prime Minister Netanyahu went before the UN in the fall of 2023, just before October 7th, he gave the world a map of the new Middle East. It did not include Palestine, and it expanded into Syria. I mean, it was much, 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 much bigger. And you said, well, whoa, what is he? To me, I said, what is he foreshadowing here? And is that what this is? I mean, will Syria be captured? And I mean, how will that play long term with Turkey? I mean, because we're in and out with Turkey. I don't understand what the alliances are, and I mean, and how America will benefit, and will the region ever see peace?
Well, I think Israel wants to make the neighboring countries as weak as possible. Um, I think that's why it is bombing. It claims it's bombing because the weaponry will potentially fall into the hands of terrorists. Of course, I'm not sure exactly who that means in the I'm sorry, the eastern part of Syria. You do have ISIS, but that's fairly limited geographically. Um, so I think Israel is simply trying to render the neighboring countries, Lebanon, which it has already done to a great extent, um, and now Syria, um, uh, figuring that will give it a freer hand to do whatever it wants to do against the Palestinians. Um, and Israel seems to be riding high these days in that regard. It's now getting no pushback from Lebanon, no pushback from Syria. It is killing people in Gaza. I don't know the statistics, but it's at the rate of something like 20 or 30 people a day. Some days it's more, some days it's less. Um, uh, uh, and that seems to be what it wants to continue to do. That's why it doesn't want a ceasefire in Gaza.
We're talking with Dr. John Quigley, Professor John Quigley, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University. Indeed, he's one of the world's foremost international legal scholars. And as my father would say, a great freedom fighter. I need you to help us to see, just as we, in the final 3 or 4 minutes here, what should we be on the lookout for? I guess I don't, because I'm like many Americans. We hear Assad is bad, but we've worked with him down through the years, um, and now he's gone. But he's with Russia, and maybe Russia and China will get into this, and on and on and on. And then we hear this morning the news report is you see that they dropped a bomb that was so powerful it measured 3.0 on the Richter scale. So it's not just that there was an overthrow of the government. It seems like there's a leveling of the country, of critical centers in the country, Professor Quickly. Who benefits from that?
Well, I think Israel, the government of Israel, figures that it benefits from that. I think they're wrong in that assessment, however, because they are clearly angering the people, not only in Syria, but in the region by doing this. And I think in the long term, it's going to redound to their detriment, even though it seems as if it is to their benefit, to be eliminating the Syrian Navy, the Syrian army. But navies and armies can be rebuilt. And I think that there may well be a resurgence that will be to the benefit of the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, they're being killed at an alarming rate while that goes on.
As we close, do you see is there an end in sight, or will this expand? Could this be the tipping point for World War III?
Well, it doesn't seem to me it's going to lead to that. But in terms of what could come about, what I would like to see is that the countries of what we call the middle powers would take a role on this and bring about some solution in Gaza that would stop the killing there. And that's a realistic possibility, I think, that there is the sentiment that you have identified of the United States actions in the region that is leading to a kind of a global South consensus, including some European countries, that something really substantial needs to be done to protect the people in Gaza.
This is as the global South is on the ascendancy. I mean, we're watching so much. It seems like you can kill a person, but you can't kill the movement. Of course, President Gaddafi was pushing for Africa to have a single currency, but he was certainly a lead. He was perhaps the strongest leader in Africa, and he was pushing for the global South to come together. And the BRICS nations are doing just that. And I'm wondering if this could be impetus for them. And even though President-elect Trump has talked about what he's going to do to BRICS, I'm at least as concerned about what BRICS can do to us, Professor Quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we do see that. You do see those countries in the ascendancy, you might say, at the international level. The whole international system, I think, is, if you think about it in a long-term sense, it's being shaken up. It was thought for a time that the United States was the only major power in the world, and now that is being challenged. We do spend more money on the military, as Phyllis Bennis was explaining, but having the strongest military doesn't necessarily make you the strongest power in the world.
What does my father say? Might doesn't make right. Right makes might. Oh, I wish we could learn that lesson Professor John Quigley, Professor Emeritus of International Law at The Ohio State University, sending you so much love. And thank you for getting on. I know we were going to work it out. I knew it. I knew we were going to work it out.
Right.
We're gonna have you back again. But first, as we go, Noemi, sending you so much love over there in the Gambia. And you had a bouncing baby boy. Everybody send this baby coming into this world. We're going to work to make this world a better place for you, my sweet. Send this child some love. And sending you, Noemi, and your beautiful family so much love, so much love, so much love. We're going to continue to work and make this world. I want to leave the world a little bit better than how I found it. And we're just going to continue to try. That's all. That's all I got for you today. Professor John Quigley, sending you so much love. My love to your family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Stay right there, everybody. We got a lot to talk about. Yeah, I'll be on in the next hour. Back in just a moment here on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota.